we benefit greatly from institutions, leaders, and thinkers dedicated to devising strategies to overcome our polarization at every level. The John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics is one such institution, and its benefactor and namesake, Jack Danforth, is one such leader. We are privileged that they, along with our law school, have brought Amy Chua here tonight. During tonight's format, Senator Danforth will engage in a public conversation with Professor Chua, and before I introduce them, I'd like to share a little bit more about each of them. Jack Danforth is an attorney and partner with the law firm of Dowd Bennett. He is also an active and extremely generous patron of numerous public organizations, including this very center, which bears his name, and aims to promote his highest ideals for excellence in understanding the relationship between religion and politics in the United States. The John C. Danforth Distinguished Professorship within that center is held by Director Marie Griffith. Jack and his wife Sally are also the generous donors of another distinguished professorship in law and religion held by my colleague John Anazu. Here at WashU, we are deeply grateful for their leadership and immense support of this important work. Senator Danforth graduated with honors from Princeton University, where he majored in religion. He received a Bachelor of Divinity from Yale Divinity School and a Bachelor of Laws from Yale Law School. He practiced law for some years, then began his political career in 1968 when he was elected Attorney General of Missouri, his first race for public office. He was reelected to that post in 1972. Missouri voters then elected him to the U.S. Senate in 1976 and reelected him in 1982 and 1988 for a total of 18 years of service in the Senate. During that time, he initiated major legislation in the areas of international trade, telecommunications, healthcare, research and development, transportation, and civil rights. Following his elected service, Senator Danforth held appointments in both Republican and Democratic administrations. As an ordained Episcopal priest, Senator Danforth has been open about his Christian faith and has presided at many occasions, including the funeral of President Ronald Reagan. He is the author of 3 books: Resurrection, Faith and Politics, How the Moral Values Debate Divides America and How to Move Forward Together, and The Relevance of Religion. Our distinguished guest tonight, Amy Chua, is the John M. Duff Jr. Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Professor Chua received both her A.B. and J.D.'s degrees from Harvard University. While at Harvard Law School, she was executive editor of the Harvard Law Review. She then clerked for Chief Judge Patricia M. Wald on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Prior to enter academics in 1994, she practiced with the Wall Street firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. Professor Chua joined the Yale Law School faculty in 2001. Her expertise is in international business transactions, law and development, ethnic conflict, and globalization in the law. Her first book, World on Fire: How Exporting Free Market Democracy Breeds Ethnic Hatred and Global Insecurity, was a New York Times bestseller and selected by both The Economist and the UK's Guardian as the best book of 2003. She is also the author of the critically acclaimed Day of Empire: How Hyperpowers Rise to Global Dominance and Why They Fail, the 2011 memoir Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, and the New York Times bestseller The Triple Package: How 3 Unlikely Traits Explain the Rise and Fall of Cultural Groups, co-authored with Jeb Rubenfeld. Her latest book, Political Tribes, Group Instinct, and the Fate of Nations, looks at tribalism on both the left and the right and urges Americans to, quote, rediscover a national identity that transcends our political tribes. The book serves as an inspiration for this evening's conversation, which we'll hear more about in just a moment. Professor Chua has appeared on leading television programs, including Good Morning America and The Today Show, and has addressed numerous government and policy-making institutions, including the CIA, the World Economic Forum in Davos, and the World Knowledge Forum in Seoul. She has won several awards, including Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in 2011, and has won Yale Law School's Best Teaching Award. We are truly delighted to have both Professor Chua and Senator Danforth here tonight for this conversation. As part of the Q&A portion, we will be accepting written questions from the audience. A few students will walk outside the aisles who will be happy to collect your questions throughout the discussion. If you didn't pick up a card and pencil on your way in, there are some at the end of each pew. Dean Stout from our School of Law will then present some of your questions to Professor Chua and Senator Danforth as the final portion of the event. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Chua and Senator Danforth to Washington University.
Thanks, Chancellor Martin, and thank you for your hospitality, and thanks everybody for being here. This is Amy Chua. This is not your first visit to Washington University. You were here 7 years ago in connection with your book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. I've read it. I am glad I'm not engaging you in conversation on that particular book. Having read it, let me just say, had I been your son, I would have spent my childhood sitting in a corner wearing a dunce cap. But this program is prompted by Professor Chua's more recent book, Political Tribes, this one, and it's an absolutely terrific book. And it's particularly a terrific book for our Center on Religion and Politics because it pertains to politics, and for those of us who are of faith, it, I think, provides some ideas of how we might be constructive in overcoming the political division in our country right now. So it really is an important book. I highly recommend it. If I were organizing book clubs in local congregations, I would have this as a book club reading, because I think for people in religious congregations, it gives us ideas of how we can be constructive in overcoming some of the divisions in our country. So, Amy, thanks so much for being here. Why, if you would, give us kind of an overview of the book, and you might start with the title of the book, Political Tribes, and why the title, and what's the meaning of the title to you?
Okay. Well, first of all, Senator, thank you so much for your kind words and invitation and generosity, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's a tremendous pleasure and honor for me to be back here at WashU, having this incredibly important conversation in this stunning venue. So, and special thanks to Marie Griffith and her entire amazing team for organizing everything so perfectly. So, tribalism and political tribalism. I guess, let me start by saying that human beings, like our fellow primates, are tribal animals. We need to belong to groups. And once we connect with a group, we tend to want to cling to it and defend it and see our group as better in every way. So in a fascinating recent study that I discuss in the book, children between the ages of 4 and 8 were randomly assigned to either the red team or the blue team, and then given t-shirts of corresponding colors. These kids were then shown computer-edited images of a whole bunch of children, half of whom were wearing red t-shirts, the other half wearing blue t-shirts. They were then asked questions about these computer images. The results were stunning. Even though these children, just between 4 and 8, knew absolutely nothing about the children in the photographs, they consistently said that they liked the kids wearing their color better, wanted to allocate more resources to them, and, perhaps most frighteningly, displayed systematic subconscious bias. That is, when told stories about these kids, they systematically remembered all the positive things about the kids wearing their color and tended to remember all the negative things about the kids wearing the other color. So humans aren't just a little tribal, they are very tribal. And once we belong to a group, our identities become oddly bound up with it. We want to benefit our group mates, even though we personally don't gain. And sometimes we enjoy the suffering of out-group members. Now, having said that, especially in St. Louis with such a great sports team, I want to say that tribalism is not necessarily always bad. Sports is a great example, one of the most tribal things, but it's fun. Family can be very tribal. The problem is when tribalism takes over a political system. That's when things get dangerous, because then you start seeing everything through your group's lens, and arguments and data and policy don't matter. You just want to stick to your group and defend it no matter what, and try to take down the other side. So that's where we sort of are right now in America. That's why we can't get anything done in Washington. We can't even talk to each other. And so I guess I'll just end this part by saying we are at the point in America where many Americans view people who voted for the other side not just as people they really disagree with and want to argue with, but rather as evil, immoral, un-American, as enemies. And that's really a dangerous situation when you feel that way about half the country.
1/3 of college students after the 2016 election unfriended or blocked somebody on social media who voted the wrong way. And we all remember Thanksgiving dinners right after the election. People were concerned about their own families. But I'm glad that you said that sports tribalism was okay. We were a little bit concerned that you would come here from New England to St. Louis and bawl us out for our enthusiasm about the Blues winning the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
Thank you. Some people, nativists, would say we are too tribal, we're too divided, there are too many different groups. They feel that these groups really threaten the basic unity of the country. They long for a day when America was identified as, a lot of people said, we are a Christian country, or we're a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. And they would say, okay, the way to overcome this political tribalism is essentially to superimpose on the country a point of view which is hearkening back to the good old days. You wrote a book called Day of Empire, and it was a study of the rise and the fall of empires over history. But one thing you said about the rise, the success of empires, was their ability to build or bring within one country a whole variety of ethnicities, different people from different parts of the globe. So I am certain that what you are not saying is the way to overcome tribalism is to superimpose a kind of a uniform, I'm the real America type of a point of view.
Absolutely. Just the opposite. So full disclosure, I'm an immigrant's kid. I'm obviously, I've written a whole book about the importance of openness and tolerance, even just from a strategic point of view. But yes, if you did adopt the view, which it's worrisome. If you look at the numbers, significant numbers of people now say things that what's key to being an American is having a European background or having a Christian background. If we were to adopt that view, Jack, we would basically lose what is special about America and what makes America great and has always made us great, even from the beginning. I think people tend to forget this, but it's really such an unusual thing that our national identity is not based on the ethnic identity of any one group in this country. I'm a comparativist, so I study China, East Asia, the European countries, and most of those countries actually originated as ethnic countries. The national identity is rooted in blood, actually. not the United States. I mean, from the very beginning, our national identity has been rooted in the principles and ideals in our US Constitution. Now, I will be the first to say that we have just horrifically failed to live up to those principles and ideals, and we're still struggling to do so. But having said that, you know, I think we often forget just how remarkable a document that was. You know, even in the founding era, America was incredibly multi-ethnic. There were, you know, Germans and Swedes and French and Dutch and Irish and Italians and Greeks speaking different languages. There was enormous religious intolerance. People often identified more as New Yorker or Virginians, and yet over time, haltingly, the Constitution succeeded in unifying an extremely diverse population under the banner of ideas. As you know, it was quite a radical act, not just for the founders to declare freedom of religion, but that there would be no established church. That was very unusual. Again, it was only after the Civil War that the Constitution was amended to kind of establish that our national identity would also be ethnically and racially neutral, not just religiously neutral. But the fact remains that if we were to start to define our national identity in terms of race or ethnicity or religion, whether it's whiteness or Christianity, we would be losing what makes America America. That would be a move in the direction of ethno-nationalism, which is really a force that's torn apart, so many countries in the developing world.
You point out in this book, Political Tribes, that in our Constitution, in the 14th Amendment, it's very clear that you are an American simply because you're born here. So, and I think you also say that it's unthinkable in France that people would think of themselves as German French. But in our country, it's very common to say somebody is, say, an Irish American or a German American or whatever, simply because they are in this place.
Yeah, so I introduced this term. I think we all take for granted what we have in this country because we have so many problems and it's a pretty polarized time. So America is what I call a supergroup, and to be a supergroup, it's very easy. The definition, there are just two requirements. To be a supergroup, first you need a very strong, overarching national identity, like American or Chinese. A lot of countries have this. But to be a supergroup, you also have to have your citizenship open to people of any background and allow individual subgroup identities to flourish. So at its best, and again, this is very unusual, at its best, America is a country where someone can be Libyan American or Croatian American or Irish American or Japanese American and intensely patriotic at the same time. And even a country, it's obvious a country like China is not a supergroup because they satisfy the first requirement, very powerful ethnic Chinese national identity. But subgroup identities, like the Tibetans or the Uyghurs, those identities are not allowed to flourish. And what I was, writing about is even a country like France, that has so much in common with us right now. It's a Western democracy. France is also not a supergroup. France has a very strong overarching French identity, but because of the principle of laïcité, you have the burkini ban, headscarf ban. It's very different. Subgroup identities are not allowed to flourish in the same way. Religious freedom, for example. And many people think that the stifling of those identities, whether from North Africa or Muslim communities, has contributed to the hostility and the failure to assimilate. So that's at our best, but that's something that is being threatened, the supergroup status, by both the right, I think, and the left. I think there's a lot of challenge. Are we still going to have this overarching identity that can connect all of us as we get more and more demographically diverse? And, are we going to be a country that is secure enough to let individual sub-ethnicities and sub-religious identities to flourish?
So talk about when tribalism really becomes a kind of a dark force, when it runs amok. What are the manifestations of that? What are the symptoms of tribalism, the kind of tribalism that you're questioning and critical of in the book?
So one thing that I've already mentioned is how there used to be so much more overlap between Democrats and Republicans. You were talking about the students who unfriended. You know, there's another statistic. It's something like 80% of, maybe I'm getting the statistics wrong, but of Democrats would feel incredibly negative if their child married a member of the other party, and vice versa. And once you have that kind of dynamic going, it's almost like an ethnic difference. You know, we all remember the day, a very different time. So that's one manifestation. Another thing that you're seeing right now that's different from, you know, even the last 50 years is a very explicit kind of identity politics on both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, we've always had identity politics, if you define that as movements, you know, based on group identity, but it's very particular right now. So I see this so starkly, on the right, we are seeing openly white nationalist movements holding rallies and conferences in a way that would have been shocking even just 5 years ago, you know, being covered in the Atlantic. And even on the mainstream right, even if people don't admit it, there is enormous anxiety and fear about whites, and particularly white men, losing their place in this country. And President Trump has really done an effective job tapping into that fear. You know, always highlighting the freshman congresswomen. I mean, he wants to make them the face of the Democratic Party. Now, on the left, what's interesting is that we are seeing a very sharp shift away from inclusivity as a watchword to a much more exclusionary approach. And it is so stark. I mean, I'm on a college campus here, but it's so stark on the college campus where I teach. Again, it's different even from 5 years ago. There is so much more self-segregation of students by race, by ethnicity, by political view, by religion. The group lines have really hardened. And I'm completely in favor of having spaces for people to feel solidarity. I mean, I think that's great. But what I used to notice is you needed forum where people could then debate and get together and cross those boundaries and relate in a different way. And now that's so much more difficult. There's a policing of group boundaries I see, which is you're called out. You know, this is the tribal part, that if you are even if you're, let's say, very progressive, but you just have a friend who is a member of the other side, you may not be fully a member of your group. You know, we might have to shame you or bully you. It's sort of like toe the line completely, or else you're out of the tribe. And that makes it very hard. I've had some success, but you really have to structure it and force these conversations. The whole idea of cultural appropriation is, again, really based on very hard group lines. Like, these are our group symbols, our group's patrimony, and other groups don't have a right to them. So when I was growing up, it was considered kind of a sign of multicultural openness for, say, a Caucasian person, a Caucasian woman, to wear a sari or a kimono. Today, those would be acts of microaggression. And it's very interesting to note that this is a very stark shift on the progressive side. If you think of the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, or even the international human rights movements of the 1990s and 2000s, those groups, those movements were really framed in terms of universalist ideals. They were inclusionary. The goal was always to transcend group lines, not emphasize them. So that's one thing you're seeing. And another thing you're seeing, I can talk more about later, is really a fracturing on both sides of the political spectrum. Because, you know, when you get tribal, it's almost just natural for the groups, the teams, to get smaller and smaller. You see the splintering. with ever smaller and smaller groups kind of pitting themselves against each other, which is what's contributing to this very toxic political atmosphere.
Well, it wasn't long ago that the great sort of liberal standard was integration. That was what we were working for, right? That was the civil rights movement, as I understood it, back in, say, the 60s. But is that gone now?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, again, definitely we've seen a proliferation. And again, I understand this. I understand, everything is much more subtle than the way the echo chambers want to make it. I understand the desire for for small groups to say, you know what, I want to be with some people that really have experienced my form of exclusion. But the key, and this is kind of related to the supergroup idea, I think it's a false choice. I think you could have both. What I like about the supergroup idea is I think it's great for people to feel, I'm really proud of my Italian identity, or I'm really proud of my Syrian background. But because we're a supergroup, I think that it shouldn't be, do you have only a strong overarching national identity and everybody has to assimilate to the liberal ideal? I don't think we need to do that. I think we have a system that allows both. I think that we can allow multicultural flourishing as long as we have this connective tissue, this overarching national identity that ties us together. And I think that has to be the Constitution, which is something that worries me because from both the left and the right, I see that the Constitution, which I think is our only hope, I think the Constitution has now come into the crosshairs of tribalism. For a lot of my progressive students, the Constitution is irredeemably stained by the sins of its authors. I was talking to the headmaster of a very elite private school in New York City, and he said he was in distress. He said, the majority of my students here have nothing but disdain for the founding fathers. White male rapists. And at the University of Virginia in 2016, I think the president of the university sent out an email quoting Thomas Jefferson, who was the founder of the university. Immediately, 469 faculty and students signed a letter saying that they were deeply offended by the use of Thomas Jefferson as an example of a moral compass. And I think that's very problematic because it is true that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they were slave owners. That is true. We can't whitewash our history, but they were also, authors of a document that led to the most inclusive form of government in human history. So I think we need to find a way. I worry that we've overcorrected, throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I mean, in my mind, one of the real problems and one of the negatives about where we are today, tribalism, is the desire to pick fights with individuals. In other words, you believe in a cause, whatever the cause is, very worthy cause, excellent cause, but for some reason it's important to personalize the opposition and to call out people for being bad people, evil people, if they don't agree with you. So you're quick there's a quickness to take offense. There's a quickness to look for something in a person's past, something that a person has said, something that a position that a person has taken, and use that as a weapon against that person. So you move from just supporting a cause, justice, to demonizing, picking on an individual. Let's say that I am not of his party, but when Joe Biden was singled out because decades ago he had taken a position on busing, and suddenly that's transformed into, well, you're some kind of a racist. And I know that in university campuses, the Halloween costume, fracas at Yale, where, as I understand it, a member of the Yale faculty, I think it was a woman,
Yeah.
took the position that the university, Yale University, should not be in the business of sending out some message about Halloween costumes. And suddenly that person came under attack as some physical attack, as some sort of just awful,
Screaming, yeah, surrounded by...
awful. I think you've had an experience like this.
I haven't. There are really some interesting studies that I write about in the book. It's very much a group, almost like mob mentality. And now we know it's related to actually neurotransmitters. There's something physiological about this. If you're just one person confronting Erica Christakis about the Halloween costume, it just wouldn't have escalated like that. It is something about being in this culture where a situation where you're really part of a group, and there's a group mentality, and the incentives are all wrong, because if you were to stand up, if one person were to be brave and say, actually, I don't even think she was quite saying that, I think she was only, just kind of feeling it out, then that person would be shamed and bullied. And so the incentive structure, and it's really troubling for a college campus where we want debate, and that used to be why we became professors. I feel it myself. I feel like I'm just going to be much more careful now, because the upside is so huge. Sorry, that the upside is not as big as the downside, and I think that's a shame. Where people just are afraid to express themselves.
I had a former student of your law school say to me very recently that, with regard to just being on campus, that his idea of just getting through is just keep his head down. So don't speak. If you have a different view, don't you dare state that different view, because then you are going to be shamed.
I still think that leadership is very important. So I have historically been very proud of having one of the most diverse classes at Yale Law School. It's just called International Business Transactions, but it developed a reputation. So the last time I taught it, I had, very, very large, 16 members of the Black Students Association, 9 Muslim Americans, and also 15 members of the Federalist Society, which is the conservative student group. And I always felt like if you, as the leader, if you just set the ground rules, because, I was saying, look, here are the ground rules. We can freely disagree, but if somebody says something that seems to offend you, can you just, for this one class, don't assume the worst, that he was, a racist or trying to hurt you, but that maybe he didn't have the right vocabulary, said something wrong, regret it. Can we, and can you will then have full time to speak. And if you set the rules, I've actually had a lot of, I'm still an optimist at heart. I feel like that if you can just de-escalate and have people start to interact as human beings, the studies show that enormous progress can be made, actually.
So the problem that you talk about and that you write about, tribalism, that's, I think, relatively new, or maybe I was just asleep and didn't notice it. But I spent a lot of my life in politics, which is a combat sport. But I never, ever saw this kind of anger. And there was always, in fact, it was the opposite. I wrote an op-ed piece a year ago about my relationship with Tom Eagleton, who was I'm a Republican, was a Democrat, and our relationship when we were colleagues in the Senate. And it was a wonderful, personal relationship, and it rubbed off on the staff of each office. So we had a joint softball team. It was called the Missouri Compromise. So I think definitely things have changed in politics. Definitely things have changed in Washington and generally in politics. but I think throughout the country. So I'm wondering why? I mean, why now? Is there something different? Is there something in the water?
There is.
That is affecting us, or what do you think it is?
Yeah, I think there are two factors. So first of all, I will say that I think that it's how I started. I think America has always been very tribal, but it feels horrible right now, but one reason it's so painful is that a lot of previously silenced voices now have the power to express them. So it's very unpleasant sometimes, but sometimes things feel like it's not tribal when one tribe is just so overwhelmingly dominant that they don't even know that they're a tribe. So one of the biggest factors why things are so painful and toxic right now has to do with the massive demographic changes that this country has been undergoing. And sometimes political correctness doesn't even allow us to talk about them, but if you look at the numbers, I mean, we've had massive immigration changes and flows, and I said I'm a fan of immigration, but you can see the numbers. So the result is that today, for the first time in American history, whites are on the verge of losing their majority status at the national level. This has already happened in California and Texas and dozens of counties across the country. And so what this means is that for the first time, every group in America is threatened. It used to be that whites weren't threatened, but today it's not just racial minorities who are threatened. American whites feel threatened. Over 50% of white Americans feel that there is more discrimination against whites than other minorities, and it's not just Republicans. 30% of Democrats feel that there is some or a lot of discrimination against whites. Today, it's not just religious minorities who feel threatened. It's not just Muslims and Jews. Christians feel threatened. You see the rhetoric in the politics, the war on Bible, war on Christianity. With Donald Trump in the White House, women feel threatened. With the Me Too movement, men feel threatened. Straights, gays, Asians, Latinos, everybody feels threatened. And studies show that it's when people feel threatened, that's when they retreat into tribalism. That's when they become more insular, more defensive, more us versus them. So that's one reason I think that you're seeing a lot of this. The other big factor has to do with something that I used to write about developing countries. And I talked about this phenomenon that was very destabilizing for democracies. And for 20 years, I said, we don't have this problem. America has a lot of other problems. And this is what I call a market-dominant minority. It's when an ethnic minority that is viewed as an outsider is resented by the poor majority as like controlling all the power. So for example, whites in South Africa, only 9% of the population, and yet they controlled for so many years all the most valuable land and all the conglomerates. The Chinese, I'm Chinese from Southeast Asia, so the 3% Chinese in Indonesia controlled 70% of the private economy in Indonesia. So I always said, America never had this problem because for most of our history, we had a different structure. We had whites were both economically and politically dominant, and when you have one group that is so dominant, it can do all kinds of terrible things. It can oppress, it can enslave, but it can also afford to be more generous. As when in the 1960s, the WASPs actually voluntarily opened up the Ivy League schools and many other schools to Jews and other minorities. I mean, they kind of volunteered that. So back to this market-dominant minority idea, I write about how coastal elites, and that's a misnomer, I kind of mean including probably people in this room, urban, cosmopolitan Americans of both sides of the political spectrum, this little group, establishment, is now regarded by much of President Trump's base and the center of the country, rural America, as a tiny group of these people who don't even really care about Americans, who, wield all the power from afar. They control Hollywood, they control Wall Street, they control Silicon Valley, they control, all the universities, and that's not untrue. What is untrue is they say, and these people, they care more about the poor in Africa than they do about the poor in this country. And so in the 2016 presidential election, President Trump's rhetoric was very similar to what I have observed in developing countries. In developing countries, there was always a populist leader who would come around and say, we need to take back our country. The tiny Chinese are controlling everything. So democracy became very destabilizing. Instead of, Americans tend to romanticize democracy. Let's just have elections. But what happens in these countries is that a populist demagogue can whip up large segments of frustrated people and say, these guys aren't real, we got to get rid of the Chinese, we got to get rid of the whites in South Africa or Zimbabwe. And, even in this rhetoric, make America great again, actually President Trump did say, we need to take back our country. You see kind of overtones of that. It's not a perfect analog because obviously coastal elites are not an ethnicity. And it's also, they're not all, from the point of view of the heartland or rural America, President Obama is the classic coastal elite because he's Ivy League educated, he sounds professorial, he's so cosmopolitan. It's a very insular group. They speak in a certain way, attend all the same schools. So that's the second dynamic where basically it's education has split America's white population in recent years. You don't see the same upward mobility, and we're starting to get this dynamic that historically was much more common in developing countries.
Two comments on that. First is that I think that this is the Trump phenomenon. I think this explains the Trump phenomenon and why he is so popular, particularly in rural America or white, say lower middle class or lower America, because I think people feel that they have been, A, overlooked, that the system is really built to help, say, other minorities and take people and move them ahead of these people. And also, there were no programs, there was no affirmative action for them. There's no affirmative action for the person in Kabul, Missouri, who makes, very modest income, but there is for other people. And I think they feel that everything has left them behind, that they're not making any progress in life, that the government is helping everybody else, and it's not helping them. And also that they're being disrespected. They're being treated as sort of yokels and rubes and the deplorables and all of that. And if people are treated that way, they're going to react. So I think that the Trump phenomenon is, even when people think, well, we recognize all of his flaws, but I think that a lot of these people think, he's a bully, but he's our bully.
Absolutely.
He is our guy. He is standing up, and we don't care about any policies. We don't care about, any of this personal stuff about him. He is our tough guy, and we want a tough guy.
And what's funny, because the tribal instinct is all about identification. And so a lot of people have said, wait, how can these poor whites not see that he's a millionaire, that he lives? And I actually think that in terms of aesthetics and the way he behaves and his style, he really is, he does behave much more like his base, So, we on a college campus will hear one outrageous thing after another thinking, oh my gosh, this is definitely going to bring him down. But in fact, people just relate to that. They relate to him eating, these big, taco bowls. And then even when he gets in trouble with the liberal press for not being feminist enough, for not being politically correct enough, for, just not reading enough books. They relate to that. That has happened to them in their own workplace. So I think you've captured it very well, that they feel like so many times, they don't like what he's saying, but, and this is what I started off with, like once you connect, it's like a sports team. Sometimes you're really mad at your team or the coach, but the idea that you would then switch to the other side, is unthinkable.
Never mad at the Blues, of course. The other thought that I had is that it's to the advantage of politicians, it's to the advantage of network news to make people feel that they've been abused and to make them feel resentful. And for a politician to say to people, you've been used, you've been taken advantage of, you have been treated with disrespect, or you have been forgotten, or the system is rigged. And this happens from both left and right. It happens for the left, for the people who say the system is rigged against you. And it happens clearly from the right also, of people who are talking about the elite, and the coasts and all this stuff. And it's this, and vote for me, vote for me because they are against you. And also it builds ratings. So you've got these 24-hour news channels. We don't need 24 hours of news. And by the way, it's not news.
Right.
It is not news. It is just whipping people into a frenzy, left or right, depending on what you happen to turn in. I'm not a social media guy. I believe it's true with the social media also. But it builds an audience, it builds ratings, and for politicians, it builds votes to try to fan this stuff up.
You go, Senator. You want the next question? It's yours.
Yeah, I do. I've got a couple of more. One is, so you talk about a supergroup. In other words, you're talking about, okay, we've got all these tribes. That's good. That's fine. Keep them all together. But there also has to be some overarching principle. So what is it?
I think it's really just the principles in our Constitution. I really do. I know it's almost sounds banal. You and I have talked about this. I think that education, we really need to rethink how we are educating our children. So we are, because of these massive demographic changes, we're in a struggle right now. We're in a process of renegotiating and rediscovering what our national identity is, and we have to find some national identity that will resonate for and be able to bind together rich and poor, urban and rural, immigrants and non-immigrants, the children, the descendants of slaves and the descendants of slave owners. So this is difficult.
Well, let me put it in a different way. Yeah. Is America exceptional? And should we be proud? Because you said earlier, of course, there is a big difference between the principles that we advocate and the reality. All men are created equal was written by a slaveholder. So, right. There is this big thing. So what should make Americans want to belong to a supergroup?
Right. So to answer your question, I write in the book, yes, I do think America is exceptional. I think I actually say there's a very technical sense in which we were exceptionally racist compared to other countries. We had alone among other powers. We had, within our boundaries for a long period of time. But I also think that we have been exceptional in an incredibly positive way. That is, unifying an incredibly diverse population under a banner of ideas in a non-ethnic or religious way. So here's what I think. I think it's good that we are not whitewashing our history anymore. I think we have to, it's important that we tell US history in an honest way. So I'm in favor of the fact that we say, look, it's not all that romantic. This is what we did to the Native Americans. This is the history. But at the same time, and this is what I meant by throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I think it's crucial to teach, to convey to our children the sense of America being a special nation. And I think it does go back to all the ways, you know, by focusing on the flaws of the Constitution and also the flaws of the drafters of the Constitution, we can overlook all the astounding successes and how extraordinary the Constitution was and what it's done. Again, I study the developing world. Most of these countries I've studied have had 50, 60, 70 constitutions. And you know, when you compare it to other countries, and that's sometimes how why immigrants are so grateful to be in this country, when you've come from somewhere else. You kind of see, so I often am asked at talks like this, is there another country that can be our model for helping us get out of political tribalism? And I always say, I think we're the best model. I mean, this is a horrible moment. You know, I've suffered.
Well, John Meacham has written really a very good book called The Soul of America. Yeah. And his point is not to say we're perfect. I mean, obviously we haven't. Yeah. We didn't do away with slavery until 1865. After that, we had Jim Crow. Then we've got women not treated, I mean, didn't even have the vote until whatever it was, 1913 or whatever. And then we have the whole, you know, people being, for sexual orientation, being discriminated against. We have all this stuff going on. But the aspiration and the movement has been to be one country. The aspiration has been to hold ourselves together. And if people are left out of that and feel left out, then the strategy is to bring them in and to make them part of it. So I mean, that is how I view the overarching principle. It is simply holding this diverse country together by making everybody a part of it.
Right, and you know, there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, justice, if you belong to an ethnic or racial group and your lived experience is that none of the laws work for you, that it's reasonable for you not to buy into the principles of the Constitution. So you know, there's a lot of work that we have to make that, you know, make all groups be able to believe that there's something worth fighting for. But so I'm critical of both sides. You know, I often say to my students who are very progressive, you know, it's easy to say, oh, America's a land of oppression. America was built on genocide and white supremacy. And what I always say to them is there's a huge difference between saying that, you know, we have shamefully and repeatedly failed to live up to our own ideals. We have done these terrible things. There's a huge difference between saying that and saying that, you know what, it's all just phony, that these principles are nothing. Because if we really are just a land of oppression, you know, rooted in genocide and white supremacy, then it's hard to see why America would even be worth fighting for. So you know, that I think it's you know, there's a lot of work to be done on both sides.
Do we have time for just a brief commercial interruption by me on the religious side of this?
Certainly.
I don't want to preempt the questions, but this is the center on religion and politics. And I think that it is the obligation of what we call the faith community, and particularly congregations, to be instruments of trying to hold the country together. And I think that's a calling. The meaning of religion comes from, the word religion comes from the same root as the word ligament. It's to bind things together. Religion has had the opposite effect, obviously, historically, but that's the meaning of the word. And it should really be something that faithful people focus on. In our church, and in I'm sure others, we exchange the peace. That is, we turn to people who may be total strangers, extend our hands and we say the peace of the Lord. Now, I think we should exchange the peace with everybody, not just people within our walls. We wouldn't say the peace of the Lord, but what we would say is, I'm your friend. I'm your friend. And think of the cultural change that would bring about. And it's something that faithful people can do. And just final comment, politics, we get all wrought up about it and mad about it. And the other guy's the enemy and somebody we've got to destroy. But it's only politics. That's all it is. So Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian of the last century, talked about religion being a matter of ultimate concern. There can't be 2 or 3 ultimate concerns, and it surely isn't politics. It can't be. And so I told this story before, and then I'll quit. But I have told this story before. So back in 1982, I thought I was going to lose my re-election to the Senate. And I almost did. I saved it at the end, but I almost lost. And I'm clearly upset, terribly, that my whole life was going to end because my political career was going to end. It was going to be over. And my then 15-year-old daughter, Dee Dee, whose son is here, tried to buck me up. And she said to me, well, it's not the World Series. and it's surely not religion.
Well, that is fantastic, Senator. And thank you for a fantastic fireside chat, Senator and Professor Chua. I'm Nancy Stout, and I get to ask all of the questions that you've been sending up this way, and there's quite a few questions, so be ready. Our first question is, in your book, you often describe tribalism as natural or primal, and psychological and even instinctual. How then does tribalism relate to history? Is your theory intentionally anti-historical in some way? Are tribal people somehow outside of history?
Interesting. I actually there are a bunch of studies that are the optimistic ones near the end of the book that, yes, humans are tribal. It's a natural instinct. In all of human society, there really are no societies where people don't live in groups. Hermits are extremely rare. But studies also show, and a large body of interdisciplinary studies also show, that if you can just pull people out of their tribes, I think this is related to Senator Danforth's inspiring call, and get them to interact really as human beings, they still feel tribal, but they can really connect. And the best example of this that I give is actually the integration of the military in the 1950s. So when they called for integration, the whole country was against it. The troops are against it, the leadership, the people. But after they did this, they did a bunch of studies, and they found, first of all, that the integrated troops were as or more effective than the all-white troops. And then they conducted a bunch of interviews. And what they found was everybody said, and this is a time when, Italian Americans had never met Swedish Americans, had never met Mexican Americans. It wasn't just all race. And it's a beautiful collection of statements. People said, when you're just alone in a foxhole or just in a bunker, or you're afraid you're going to die, you miss home, you don't really care what kind of accent the person next to you has. If your life is in danger, you don't care what the color of skin of the person next to you is. And so there were a lot of terrible things about the Vietnam War, but one thing that positive came out of it was that very, very people of different religious backgrounds, different ethnicities, actually saw each other as individuals. And even with same-sex marriage, there's another bunch of surveys that show this, that even just, I think it was like 15 years ago, only 11% of the American population approved of same-sex marriage. Now I think it's up to 63%. Why? People started learning that it was their children, their neighbors, their friends, people that they knew as human beings, not just these faceless people easy to demonize. And so that changed public opinion so quickly. So I don't know if I'm answering the question exactly, but I certainly don't think I'm trying to be ahistorical. There are plenty of examples, actually, of great leaders. Nelson Mandela is a great example. Everybody, the prediction there is that this is going to be a time when tribalism is going to take the country apart because, oh my gosh, finally this incredibly subjugated population now takes power. And that didn't happen. Mandela was a very, very inclusive, it's an almost superhuman person. So I don't think I'm being ahistorical. I just think that, you have to kind of search for those examples. And right now it's easier to focus on the negatives.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Could you talk a little bit more about your idea that the Constitution is our hope? As you point out, your students have long noted that the founding era privileged the white propertied man. It took a war to open up the Constitution to racial equality. It took many, many more decades to open up the Constitution to gendered equality. And even then, a lot of people say that what really happened was it was custom and statutes that proved to create equality across the country. Is it possible that it's not the formal Constitution, but rather it's the American psyche? We are always trying to do better.
I feel like I'm not sure, I feel like that's almost more romantic. I'd like to think about it. It's a really interesting question. For me, the way I see it is that America is an aspirational country. We always have been. Our reality has always exceeded our ideals. I end the book with a poem by Langston Hughes that is very beautiful. He said all of this. He's like, the Constitution didn't apply to anybody. It didn't apply to the Native Americans. It didn't apply to, and yet he said, let America be America. We're all looking for that day. I don't know if people have seen the play Hamilton. What's interesting about the play Hamilton is I think that it is incredibly patriotic, actually. It deliberately takes groups that have been excluded for the whole history of America and puts them center stage. So it seems, it's very jarring that way. But it's actually, if you read it, it's a play that actually really values the Constitution and sees it as almost like, let's imagine the day when those ideals really can apply to everybody equally, kind of working backwards. So I'll have to think about it. Mm-hmm.
Just another little angle on the Constitution, because most people, when they think about the Constitution, they think about individual rights. And they think about the Bill of Rights. But it's important to think about the structure of the Constitution and the way it was written. And it was written consciously. This is Madison. It was written in order to hold together different interests. The interests today are more and more complex than they were then. But that was the structure of the Constitution. And Article 1, which is the Congress, was the part of the Constitution written in order to hold these groups together, so that everybody with a point of view or with an interest could come to one place, present their point of view, hopefully work things out, maybe not, but hopefully reach some sort of compromise and work things out. What is lost today is Article 1 of the Constitution. What is lost today is the Congress. Congress is feckless today. It does not do its job. There are reasons for that, and particularly where I serve in the U.S. Senate, it is really feckless. And one of the goals that we should have somehow is to try to restore the role of the Congress as the policy-making branch of government.
Mm-hmm.
I go to high school in a town that is very liberal. Tribalism is very real at my school. I feel that my teachers are often weighing in with their own political perspective and their own stances. How can we possibly pull away from this fractured system if every day we are taught to dislike the other side at our school?
Oh, it's a great question. It's so much wisdom. I think that one of the biggest problems is that we just can't talk to each other anymore. It's, you know, so I was saying that I'm a big fan of immigration, but I feel like somebody should be allowed to say, you know, these big demographic changes are making me anxious, and I don't know, is this good? Should there be a limit? What should the rules be? We should be able to have that kind of a conversation. People should be able to express their anxiety about terrorism. But right now we've gotten to the point, certainly on campuses, where you can't even use certain words. You just even express a tiny bit of anxiety about immigration, you're instantly a xenophobe or you're Islamophobe. And I think this is terrible. I mean, it's, I know it's a little bit related. I still think that maybe it relates to what the senator was saying about Congress. Like, I still do believe in great leaders. You know, and it could be teachers in that sense, you know, to set the example, because I think that sometimes I think that currently in our system, we don't reward bravery anymore. You know, there's tribalism. If somebody's being called out, this person's terrible. If you now, as a young high schooler, want to stand up and defend even somebody you don't agree with, you're just going to be called out more, canceled. I think it has to come from inspiring leaders, and, you know, maybe there are people who are gonna, another thing is I think people are just starting to get exhausted. You know, you hear the most shrill voices, it's everywhere, but when I talk to people, when I meet people, I just feel like more and more Americans are so tired of this and actually do want to reach out to the other side and move away from this. But I know I couldn't even begin to answer that question. You know, we have a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm. What can ordinary and diverse citizens do to combat tribalism and polarization in public forums?
In public forums. In public forums. Well, you know, let me start with one thing on the optimistic note. When I started giving, you know, talks around the country, I started hearing about all of these organizations that I'd never heard of trying to bridge the divide. And that was incredibly, you know, it was uplifting for me. So I don't know if this counts as a public forum, but one of my favorites is Make America Dinner Again. And so were these two maybe college kids from the Bay Area. After the Trump election, they were devastated. They couldn't get out of bed for a week. They were just crushed, thinking of leaving the country. And then they realized that they had never actually spoken or met a Trump supporter. So they started this program, having dinner parties. Now you can find it. It's amazing. Just initially in the Bay Area, where you would bring people from different sides of the political spectrum. They would have dinner. And it's actually quite astonishing that they've now spread to lots of different places. To answer your question, something that I have been very excited about as one way, maybe this counts as a public thing, to bridge, you know, I mentioned, I think there are many different tribal divides destroying this country right now, or undercutting, and one of them is the one I mentioned, the sort of between rural, you know, working class, you know, essentially President Trump's base, and kind of coastal elites and urban cosmopolitan groups. And the mutual disdain and stereotyping between these two groups is so intense that it's almost what social scientists would call an ethnic difference. That is, there is so little intermarriage and interaction between these two groups. It is more common for a student who attends Columbia to marry, you know, a Caucasian person who attends Columbia University to marry somebody from Nigeria or India or Jamaica or Asia than it would be for that person to marry somebody from Appalachia. I mean, that's how different it is. So one idea I had is, you know, maybe some form of a national service program. And, you know, because the draft served this purpose for so many years. It brought people, rich and poor, different backgrounds together. Now, we don't have that anymore. But what we do have right now is a lot, after high school, I'm sure their parents here, a lot of our kids, especially privileged kids, go off, they spend a gap year. Usually it's Australia or Ecuador or Amsterdam. Often they go with their own friends, so they're still in the same bubble. And they do amazing things, wonderful things. But what if we had a program, whether voluntary or mandatory, where children from the coast, from California, from more elite backgrounds, were encouraged to go to another part of America where they would ordinarily never set foot and work side by side with young kids or youngsters of their same age working towards a common project. Not in a condescending way, like, let me teach you something, but just working side by side. So the reason I brought this up is I feel like this idea is something that's getting traction simultaneously in all different circles. I remember thinking of it, and then just totally coincidentally, Tim Wu, who writes for the New York Times, sent me an email proposing the same thing. And I know at Brookings, they've been talking about it. I think Mayor Pete has been talking about it. So that might be one way to start early enough to get people to relate to each other, before, because when you encounter people already in your political tribes, it's very hard to break down.
Make America dinner again. I like that. I've heard people say make America Great Britain again, but but you say Great Britain failed, so make America dinner again. I like that. So maybe that's a call to action. All of us should try to bring some people home and have some conversations. Okay, so we have a lot of questions and not a lot of time. In your book, you refer to our age of political correctness. This seems perhaps dismissive of very important critical interventions by feminists, anti-racists, and others who are seeking greater social justice for the oppressed. Why reject such efforts out of hand?
Actually, I don't. I actually don't even like the term political correctness. I think there's a whole arsenal of vocabulary on both sides of the political spectrum that are just weaponized. Racist, even political correctness, these terms lose their meaning. So I actually agree with the questioner. I think that there have been incredibly important interventions. I think it's great that people don't use certain terms or say certain things or just assume, so I'm generally very sympathetic to that. Where I guess disagree is where it almost just seems like what the senator was saying, where it almost seems like when it becomes like a game that you're just waiting, it's like a gotcha game. You're just waiting, wait for somebody to trip up. And there is a class dimension to this too, because I've noticed this with a lot of my students who maybe come from not so wealthy families, and the vocabulary of what we have to say now on college campuses, it changes so quickly. When Latinx and all, and we're all constantly being trained. If you're somebody from a different background, maybe not so wealthy, not from the same educational background, how can you know exactly the right vocabulary? So that's when I feel like it's when you have a lack of generosity, and it's not even really about improving things and trying to make a better form, but rather just like this kind of gotcha. I think that's mostly what I think is not productive.
Mm-hmm. Would you consider countries like the United Kingdom, with strong sub-identities, including the Scots and the Northern Irish, a supergroup?
No, I don't. I actually, it's kind of interesting because, the UK seems a lot like us, but, and David Cameron has talked about this, the United Kingdom's, their overarching national identity, which would have to be British or the United Kingdom, is actually very weak right now, right? Because there's very strong subgroup like the Irish mentality or Scottish, and that's why you see all this secession movements and referenda, a lot of multiculturalism. The reason that they don't have a very strong overarching national identity is twofold. First, Britishness is very much associated with Englishness because it's the largest portion of the population. I think it's 80%, and that naturally doesn't sit so well with very strong kind of Scottish nationalism or Irish nationalism. And the second reason that it's hard to come up with a very vibrant overall national identity is that empire is absolutely anathema in Paulette circles. So if you were to have this British identity, so much of it is wrapped up with this long history of the British Empire, and that's something that's very uncomfortable. So actually, the politicians there, actually, when I go there, they talk about this, like how we have, there's a lot of multiculturalism, a lot of, even with Brexit going on, you can see that, but the overarching glue to hold the whole United Kingdom together is something people worry about.
Mm-hmm. There's a series of questions in this genre, so I'll try to put them together. White Americans undeniably have had a legacy of privilege and power. Could Americans be healed faster if white Americans owned up to their role in promoting exclusion? Or what specifically can white Americans do to promote inclusion in a national identity?
Yes, I mean, I think that when I said that we're kind of renegotiating our history right now, yes, I think it is important to de-romanticize our history, to acknowledge that when we talk in these amazing terms, even the Constitution's principles, that actually for much of our history, those values and rights were actually not extended to entire groups and, women. Myself, I think it's very dangerous I'm not a huge fan of this, like, check your privilege or the worst thing. It goes back to human nature. I think it's human nature to want to belong to a group that you feel proud of, that you want to defend. And I think it can only last so long to be, you're from a terrible group, an oppressive group, you're the worst thing on earth, and you should just, go underground. Because what happens is that those people will start to be very, very susceptible to very lethal populists, right? They will go underground, they will go to darker circles where people are saying, white people aren't so bad. And in fact, look at all the things that white people have invented. And in fact, who's really bad? And so I find it very dangerous, that direction. Again, I've studied ethno-nationalism for so long, and I just don't like anything in the direction of just calling out an entire group based on their skin color or blood, whether it's black or white. So I do feel there should be some ownership of the fact that that our history is, as I said, I don't think our history should be whitewashed, but I'm not sure, even just strategically, for bringing people together and maximizing more rights and more justice, that's the way to go. I think partly that's why we see these toxic white nationalist groups, why we see these horrific, supremacist groups that are gaining traction. I think it's the combination of whites feeling that they are losing power, and easily being drawn into these crazy people saying there's white genocide going on. They start to feel like they're in a war, and you see the violence coming out. So in general, I just think it's a dangerous way to talk, about a whole people that you should. I don't know. I don't think it's psychologically sound.
You mention in your book that people who say, I am tired of being called a racist.
Yeah, these are actually interviews of often, I even see this at Yale Law School, progressive young men, just exhausted, and then I do see them go underground. I see smaller groups talking amongst themselves freely, and that's where it's more dangerous, because there's nobody to check them. Because if they're going to be called out right and left publicly, they're not going to talk to those people, and it's going to go into their own echo chamber, and then, again, things just get more dangerous, I think.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And this is a question that is also showing up in a series of the cards. And it relates to what you've talked about in the past in your written work, the concept of free market democracy. And you've specifically argued that exporting free market democracy can create ethnic hatred and undermine peace. And yet, some people see America as becoming great through the Constitution and a commitment to free market democracy. So do you think maybe that one reason we've turned to tribalism is because of our decline in world dominance and economic status?
Wow. These are such great questions. I'm going to have to, there are like at least 10 different questions embedded that. Well, for sure, economic insecurity is one demonstrated factor in the rise of tribalism. For sure, there was much less social mobility and upward mobility in America right now, which is, you know, it used to be that education was the great equalizer, that you could go to a state school or not too expensive school here, and then do pretty well, and then maybe move to a coast. And at this point, a lot of those traditional avenues of rising have been cut off for reasons that a colleague of mine has just written a book, Daniel Markovits, called The Meritocracy Trap, how education is so expensive now, and the tutors, and you can't even live in Silicon Valley or New York City. It's astronomically expensive. So the rigidification of class is something that I think definitely contributes to tribalism. How exactly that relates to free market democracy, I've actually written it touches a couple of books related to this, so I might have to table that one.
Unfortunately, it's time to bring our evening to a close, and I have just a very few short remarks to make. But first, let's thank our participants, Amy and Jack, for this great conversation. Just very briefly before I let you go, I want to remind you that you're all warmly welcomed now to a reception and book signing in Umrath Lounge, which is just a short walk from here. We have lots of food and drink already out, and copies of Professor Chua's book, Political Tribes, will be on sale, and she'll be glad to sign a copy for you. Please join us as well for other events sponsored by the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics this semester. Our next event, Eddie Glaude, who is Princeton University's James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor, will be speaking on October 24th about James Baldwin and the moral crisis of American democracy. And then lawyer and religious freedom expert Asma Uddin will speak on October 28th about Islam and America's fight for religious freedom. This event was organized by Professor John Anazu and will include a panel discussion with Professors Tazeen Ali and Lori Mafley-Kipp, as well as Anazu. Thanks so much to Nancy Stout and the Law School for this great collaboration tonight with the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, and please join me once again in thanking our distinguished guest speakers.